Why Kamala Harris' strange reputation works. Vice President Kamala Harris's presidential campaign has moved the focus from President Joe Biden's shortcomings to her opponent, Donald Trump, with that simple jab and a more concise strategy. She attended at rallies this week with her new vice presidential pick, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, demonstrating her shift in tone. With Beyoncé's Freedom as their music, the pair argued that they were protecting American freedoms from their strange Republican opponents, Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance. "We're not going back," Ms. Harris told a Philadelphia gathering, leading a chorus of the campaign's motto. It pares down Mr. Biden's 2020 claim that Trump is a threat to democracy and portrays the former president as out of touch with American life. Even the vice president's press releases, from a campaign that served Mr. Biden, have reflected the tone shift from serious to lighthearted. 5 days after Mr. Biden resigned, a Harris representative said a Trump speech made him sound like someone you wouldn't want to sit near at a restaurant. Campaign strategists say this new messaging is reaching Democrat-leaning voters because it makes voting for Ms. Harris seem more like a common-sense option than a civic duty. This sudden goodwill for a vice president who struggled to attract American voters until lately may not survive until November's election. Democrat California Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, who is close friends with the vice president, said the campaign's new tone shows Ms. Harris's great sense of humor and ability to be a wonderful communicator on a very basic level. These things are proving to be her strengths, and her joyfulness is bursting through the dark, frightening undertones of Donald Trump and his running mate. Trump, who joined politics during the 2016 presidential campaign as a skilled mudslinger and passionate campaigner, has struggled to respond, especially to the weird framing. "They're odd. Nobody ever called me odd." Trump told conservative radio host Clay Travis this week, "I'm a lot of things, but odd I'm not." Press freedom honeymoon. Polls show Ms. Harris, who trailed Trump, is now ahead. The New York Times and Siena College survey from August 5 to 9 puts Ms. Harris ahead of Trump by 50% to 46% in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, 3 battleground states. It follows a YouGov poll from 4 to 6 August that found 45% of respondents would vote for her in November, compared to 43% for Trump. That reversed fortunes. A YouGov poll roughly 3 weeks ago showed her losing by 3 points. According to David Polyanksy, deputy campaign manager for Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' 2024 presidential candidacy, Ms. Harris may have been playing Trump at his own game. As the nation's top political narrative, Trump has enjoyed earned media or free press since his first presidential run. However, Ms. Harris's remarkable rise to the top of the Democratic ticket weeks before the Democratic National Convention has dominated headlines and airwaves without a significant media interview. Mr. Polyansky said upsetting the former president, who was most recently assassinated, is difficult. "It's actually very remarkable," he added. Choosing Mr. Walz as her running mate boosts her candidacy. The impact of his decision on polling is unclear, but political pundits who predicted Republican victories in Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia now consider them toss-ups. Last month, Mr. Walz was the first to adopt the weird label in television appearances supporting Ms. Harris's candidacy. He repeated it at that Philadelphia rally with Ms. Harris, calling their Republican opponents creepy and yes, absolutely odd as hell. The BBC interviewed numerous voters who liked Mr. Walz's folkiness. They admired the Minnesota governor's candor. Tyler Engel, an independent Ohio voter vacationing in St. Augustine, Florida, said Mr. Walz seems like a normal guy, a family man between cigarette drags. "Normal people are what our country lacks," Mr. Engel said. Another Chambersburg voter, John Patterson, called Mr. Walz a really sincere person. "What you see is what you get with him," he said. Weird dealing with voters? Political advisors praised the weird label's usefulness. Many stated it had a big impact since it was authentic, not a cliché, and came fast and organically. Brian Brokaw, who worked on several of Ms. Harris's campaigns and ran a super PAC that supported her 2020 presidential campaign, said calling Trump and J.D. Vance weird repackaged President Biden's threat to democracy theme in a very understandable, almost lighthearted way that was maybe less severe and more colloquial. He said the word immediately changed the election from a vote on Mr. Biden's 4 years in office to do we really want to go back to what we were doing during the Trump era? Republican pollster Frank Luntz was doubtful. On BBC Newsnight on Tuesday, he named Ms. Harris the new frontrunner, citing momentum. He called the strange label odd in itself since voters didn't like it. According to BBC interviews, several hesitant voters understood the catchphrase. In an age of political name-calling, Atlanta independent voter Jacob Fisher said calling Trump and Mr. Vance weird was fair and mildly disrespectful. "I think it's fair," Mr. Fisher responded. "You can't argue it's harsh because the other guy calls his opponents vermin. So weird? No idea, but Donald Trump can't complain." Trump supporters were underwhelmed by the campaign's recent messaging. Frank and Teresa Walker of Illinois believed the U.S. was going to hell under the Biden-Harris administration, and Florida Trump voter Jem Lowry didn't like Harris's vice president pick or the weird label they've used to describe Trump, Mr. Vance, in the Republican platform. "I think the Democrats are the odd ones," Lowry told BBC. "I don't think it's appropriate to label Republicans ODD.MS. Harris's brat summer ends." Though Mr. Walz and the Democratic National Convention will ensure Ms. Harris's media domination, observers say the campaign must change gears shortly. Ms. Harris's longtime advisor, Mr. Brokaw, said her team must work to maintain its energy since the vice president became the Democratic nominee. "The convention is the honeymoon's pinnacle, and then it's a grind for 2 months with debates," Mr. Brokaw added. "This is exciting, but it will return to reality and then it's go time. If we're still talking about Trump and Vance being odd in October, I'd be surprised," he said. Republican strategist David Polyanksy said the label works well from a 60,000-foot view but believe the economy and immigration will sway voters in November. For Trump, he must not take the bait, focus on his message, and remind people of his record and the administration's failings on both topics.